say a few words on behalf of the Consular General. By the way, I'm speaking also on behalf of Patrizia, who is our educational officer. She is fantastic. Thanks, Patrizia. I think I can start by saying that in the last 6 months, the followers of the platform Italian Innovators have gone from 200 to 750, and from 1,000 to 5,000 views every month. This is a staggering statistic. Everybody, please, let's extol the virtues of our master and Professor Luca Cottini. Thank you, Luca, for what you're doing for the community. And it's not a chance, that's not, how can I say, for a joke that we gave the high patronage of the Consular General to this initiative, because we believe that Cottini is our flagship among the organizers of cultural events in Pennsylvania and further. So I would call on you to show our sympathy and respect by bringing more users to its platform, please. Now, I will say a few words for Fellini and Calvino. They are my idols. When I was a child, I used to be mesmerized by their, visions. And they both use very powerful and symbolic scripts, easily understandable for a simple public, at the border of funny and comic, and at the same time, or at your will, extremely articulated and deep. I think we are in front of two best ambassadors of creativity in the 900 for literature and cinema. So no many words from me. Thank you. Luca, the floor is yours.
And this presentation is really my personal homage to Federico Fellini after last year's celebrations of the centenary of his birth. And this is also a reflection based upon Italo Calvino's own story and self-awareness, which is exposed in the short story Autobiografia di uno spettatore, autobiography of a spectator, and his reflections on the narrative synergies of Italian literature and cinema in the 20th century. Now, Fellini and Calvino, as Consul Forlano was saying, are two of the most revered and beloved narrators of the post-war era. But rarely their works and life paths are observed as part of a parallel trajectory. In Italy, many intellectuals move back and forth from literature to cinema, so from adaptations or scripts, so Luigi Pirandello, Guido Gozzano, Gabriele D'Annunzio, and Giovanni Verga, to the extraordinary case of Pierpaolo Pasolini, who works the same aesthetics with the two formats. Now, what makes the Fellini-Calvino case singular, instead, to me, is the fact that their parallel path did not evolve in a fusion of languages. So Calvino did not write for cinema, and Fellini did not venture into literature. But what is interesting is rather that they interacted in a form of mutual empowerment of their respective tools. Now, the occasion for a dialogue on Calvino and Fellini's literary and cinematographic aesthetics came in 1974, when the Turin publisher Einaudi, for which Calvino was still working, even though he was based in Paris at the time, Einaudi asked him to write a foreword to the volume Quattro Film, which collected the scripts of 4 movies by Fellini: I Vitelloni, La Dolce Vita, Giulietta degli Spiriti, and 8 e mezzo, 8 and a half. At the time, Calvino was the editor of the series Cento Pagine for Einaudi and was used to writing blurbs and for back covers, reviews, or prefaces. But on this occasion, the request by the publisher became the pretext for a larger autobiographical text entitled Autobiografia di uno spettatore, we talked about it earlier, where the critical introduction to Fellini's cinema in the second half of the text is preceded by what Calvino calls an exercise of memory in the first part. An exercise focusing on their common youth, their common experience as spectators, and their common discovery of cinema as Calvino calls it, another dimension of the world. Now, despite their difference in tone, so a recollection in the first half and a critical essay in the second, the two parts of the text are actually not merely juxtaposed, but rather constitute the complementary and continuous poles of a broader conversation on their style, moving from their common imagination of distance in the 1930s to their common narration of absolute closeness in the 1970s. Now, in tracing the impact of their youth as spectators on their later career, Calvino then reappreciates the parallel yet untouching elements of their career and autobiographies. Now, in recalling the years of their adolescence, Fellini was born in 1920 and Calvino in 1922, the writer identifies three main commonalities with the director. First, they both came from a city on the sea, on the Riviera, Rimini for Fellini and Sanremo for Calvino. Second, they both experienced some form of repression at home and under fascism. Third, they shared a common fascination for cinema. Now, let me start from this last point and recollect the others in a backward order. Now, cinema coincided with an experience of both fullness and loss. As a young spectator, Calvino found in movies a different space, full, necessary, and coherent, opposed to the chaos of reality outside the screen. Now, in his autobiography of a spectator, he recollects the cinematographic habits of his youth. So checking programs, swinging by the movie theater at different hours of the afternoon, daydreaming in the dark room, going to the movies without his parents' knowledge, and watching parts or fragments of films depending on the hour he entered the theater. But in his experience, cinema represented then what he defines as distance, or the opening of another world, as also underlined by the contrast between the inside, dark, and the outside, the brightness of the day, outside the movie theater, and also by the discontinuity between the world of fiction and reality. Now, the only point of contact between the world inside and the world outside came from a little window that the cinematographic operator used to open every once in a while, connecting the dark room to the main street of Sanremo. Now, Calvino's memories of the sala, the room, and of his discovery of cinema largely coincide with Fellini's apprenticeship as a spectator at the Fulgor Theater of Rimini, as we'll see in a clip from Amarcord. This would be a key reference also for Giuseppe Tornatore, whose fascination for visual storytelling is describing in the poetic relationship between the young Salvatore and the projectionist Alfredo in Nuovo Cinema Paradiso. Now, Calvino's lyrical remembrance of this period of cinematographic apprenticeship and discovery of the power of imagination overlaps, however, with the awareness of an inevitable loss, that time is now gone forever. So the idea of loss will be central to Fellini as well, as we'll see later in a clip from La Dolce Vita. For Calvino, this loss takes the form of a void of contents and memory. In a way, as he tries to recollect the repertoire of American movies from the 1930s, he realizes, in fact, that his own habits to enter the theater halfway through a movie had left in him only a number of gaps to be filled and fragments to recompose piece by piece. In another way, as he textually searches the meanders of memory and completes a posteriori an ideal catalog of movies, actors, and roles with the stubbornness of a collector, he finds out that not even erudition, or as he said, consulting manuals, repertoires, or special encyclopedias is enough to restore in its fullness an ideal album of this age, heroic age, really. Despite the confusion of fragments and the awareness of a loss, recuperating these early experiences through memory is a key exercise for him in recovering the origin of both his own vocation to storytelling and his own combinatory style. So gaps in half-seen plots, in fact, excited his vocation to storytelling and his own, excited his creative imagination, and the set patterns of American cinema allowed him to first see the narrative movement as a combination of fixed variables. Now, this intuition will later lead Calvino to collect and analyze the mechanism of Italian fairy tales along the lines of Vladimir Prop's formalism. And then later on in the 1970s, this will lead him to elaborate his conception of literature as a combinatory game, as an infinite interplay of elements, as we'll see in the Invisible Cities of 1971 and in The Castle of Crossed Destinies of 1973. Now, the second element of commonality between Calvino and Fellini is the experience of repression as a forced interruption to the otherness and freedom of the cinematographic space. So the experience of repression found manifestation for both at home. For Calvino, in a secular form, in the rigid maternal control over his activities, and in her attempt to determine for him only what he calls relationships with the world that were directed to a specific goal. And for Calvino, for Fellini, instead, it came in a religious context, so with the trauma and horror for the monolithic ritualism of popular faith. In this context, the cinematographic experience represented for both of them a form of escape. Calvino remembers that he disguised his trips to the theater by telling his mother he was going to study at a friend's house, and that he often left before the end of movies not to incur in his parents' anger. In Amarcord, by Fellini, the autobiographical character of Titta embodies the contrast between the youth's wanderings of imagination at the Fulgor theater, watching an American movie, and his father's repressive reaction to it. Now, here is the scene of that I described of Titta telling his father he went to the Fulgor cinema and watched movies with Americans and Indians, and his father reacts to it. You don't need to understand all the words. Fellini is pretty, like his images are pretty self-explanatory. Here it is.
Buono sto Sangiovese. È buono, eh? Senti un po', carina, dove sei stata ieri sera?
Where were you last night?
Al cinema, babbo.
At cinema,
Fulgor.
Fulgor.
Cosa faceva?
Zio, c'erano gli indiani nel film e gli americani volevano entrare nel territorio dei Comanci, no? E avevano costruito un ponte con la
Telling
ferrovia.
about the
Ma
movie.
gli indiani si sono messi lì sopra e ci tiravano le frecce. Quante ne tiravano, babbo?
tante,
Ne avranno ammazzati.
Ma te cosa facevi adesso?
Cosa è successo?
Per te!
Aurelio, lascialo stare! Vieni qui!
So as you see, like the father's reaction embodies this form of family repression of cinema as a category of the mind. Now, in addition to family repression, Calvino and Fellini have in common the experience of the fascist repression, and in particular what Calvino calls the clumsy anti-Hollywood campaign that the regime launched in 1938, that they both saw as the privation of a dimension, a space of the mind, or as a definitive fracture, as Calvino states, something disappeared then from my life, which will no longer reappear. Now, this breaking point is identified as the watershed between the adolescence and adulthood of both Calvino and Fellini. The transition from the aesthetic distance to the closeness, the cinema of closeness. In addition to the fascist cinematographic embargo of non-Italian movies starting in 1938, Fellini and Calvino shared in the same years also a common fascination for the comic magazines Marco Aurelio, Il Bertoldo, and Il Corriere dei Piccoli, as well as a common apprenticeship for the master illustrator Cesare Zavattini, who will become like influent in Fellini's movies, and he was a great illustrator of comics. Calvino and Fellini were both readers and illustrators of vignettes. It's quite interesting to study the vignettes, the early vignettes of Calvino and Fellini. In the Autobiografia, Calvino stresses what he calls the continuity between Fellini as a comic illustrator and Fellini as director, and similarly finds in Zavattini the roots of his own narrative technique aimed at deforming and caricaturizing the particular in order to evoke through it the vision of a world. This metonymic and caricaturizing strategy will be a key element in Calvino's fiction, from the gaze of Marco Valdo, focused on the minimalistic take on little elements as reverberations of the universal, to the comic and grotesque deformation of QFWFQ, who is the protagonist of his Cosmic Comics of 1966. Later on, in the early 1980s, the character, Calvino's character of Palomar, will represent this tension to see the detail as an evocative and deformative element, allowing the recreation of the whole and the critique of the present against any reduction or oppression. Calvino praises Fellini's Giulietta degli Spiriti for what he calls its precision of evocation obtained through the exasperation of caricature. And he praises it as an example of the director's ability to move from caricature to the visionary. The same strategy which applies to the representation of fascism, for example, in the famous parade scene of Amarcord, is also outlined by Calvino in Fellini's movie Clowns, where the writer explains, it is enough in Clown that the station master, mocked by kids on a train, calls the train police a black mustached soldier, and that silently all kids' arms are raised in a Roman salute, and the atmosphere of an epoch is restituted fully and unmistakably. So Calvino will apply the same method of ironic deformation in his short story, I ritratti del Duce, as he recreates an atmosphere beyond stereotypes through the distorted vision of the different poses, portraits of Mussolini, of Mussolini's portraits. Now, I want to go back to the clown scene that Calvino mentioned to show you the technique, this technique of grotesque deformation of details. And this is the scene from Clowns that I was mentioning. In case you're wondering what the characters are saying, they are speaking in dialect. So it's actually very difficult from in Italian for Italians as well to understand exactly what they say. But again, the images speak for themselves. Look at the train master and his grotesque imitation of Mussolini, and and the mockery of the kids to him, and the arrival of the fascist hierarchy that reconduces the situations to order. Here it is.
I vetturini della stazione litigavano sempre.
Ma la zona austriaca sono dem Grand Hotel tutta la notte, liebe. La Lasse Marie, l'emporta via nella
La porta a te c'è.
Ma je Corvillac, tu Villac!
People of the
Insulti, bestemmie da far sprofondare la città, scassottate, frustate, finché arrivava a Cotechino, il capo
Till Cotechino, the train station arrives.
Ma dove credete di essere? In piazza?
fidanzato! Fidanzato! Dimmi come ti chiami! Ti denuncia le competenze di autorità! Mascalzone! Tu come ti chiami? Ti mando in galera! Ti mando in galera a tutti! Tu, dai, ti conosco il tuo papà, ti mando in galera! Vi rovino per tutta la vita! Vi denuncio alle competenti autorità!
So the grotesque deformation of a detail. So not the representation of fascism with a direct denunciation, but the use of one detail of the caricaturization of one aspect and its grotesque deformation that evokes an entire atmosphere, evokes the whole. Now, the third element of commonality for Calvino and Fellini is the sea, as a metaphor of otherness and a constant term of comparison. Now, the sea, the Riviera, is a recurring presence in Calvino's narrative. So from the short story La Formica Argentina, the Argentinian ending to Palomar, and also in Fellini's cinematography in Vitelloni, Amarcord, Giulietta degli Spiriti. Now, the sea is the important background of the concluding scene of La Dolce Vita that we mentioned earlier. The scene, which we'll watch in a minute, visually exemplifies the trajectory that Calvino traces in his autobiography of a spectator from the cinematography of marvel and distance as young spectators to the narrative of closeness in the post-war work and in his arrival to criticism. Now, in the scene, you will see the end of a party attended by the protagonist, the journalist Marcello Rubini, interpreted by Marcello Mastroianni. And as the characters walk on the beach at dawn, at the end of a long night partying, they find a sea monster. And the word monster, monstrum, actually in Latin means both awe and terror. We only keep the meaning of terror in our modern languages. But like as the parties leave for their inability to understand what this monstrum is, or for their inability to even be astonished by it, Marcello instead stays and sees far ahead on the shore a young girl whom he had met earlier on in the movie. The girl, as a symbol of innocence and purity, screams something at him, gesticulating a message, which, however, Marcello cannot hear nor understand. And here is the scene. Where it's like the characters are bringing in this monster from the sea once again. And they talk about it.
Ehi ragazzi, venite a vedere, c'è un mostro!
There's a monster here.
Terrible. Oddio, lo guardate! Il a la bouche pleine de méduses.
Ma è vivo!
Questo è morto da 3 giorni.
They talk about it, what is it, but they don't understand really what it is.
Le maschio o femmine?
Ma che c'è da guardare?
Chi ti ha dato questa? Perché? Bella. Le vuoi bene la mamma? Bravo, bisogna voler bene la mamma, dai.
Perché non lo compriamo? Ce lo vendiamo. Ma schönes Bild, man müsste die Trocknung mit voller ausstopfen.
Tu hai visto là davanti di chi?
Che strano, chissà da dove viene.
Beh, è una curiosità,
Questo
vorrei
viene
saperlo.
dall'Australia?
Perché di Australia?
Ma è possibile che nessuno sappia qual è davanti e di dietro?
They talk about
Però,
other things,
poverino.
and he keeps looking at the monster.
E questo insiste a guardare.
He insists on watching. This is what Marcello says. And everybody leaves because they don't understand what this is. And a girl appears.
Non capisco, non si sente.
I don't understand, I can't hear.
Non sento, non si sente.
Now, in this scene, the sea shifts from a sight of marvel, so the monstrum, the awe, the innocence of the girl, also the innocence of their adolescence in front of cinema, into a symbol of incommunicability, as the drunkenness of the character and the noise make it impossible to decipher its signs. So Marcello is left alone in front of it, remembering a past attraction, but he's no longer able to comprehend its language. So this representation of loss applies to cinema as well, as the author and the director move from the pre-war cinema of distance as mystery and imagination to their post-war flipped cinema, cinema rovesciato, which only gives what Calvino calls the irreversible sense that everything is close, tight upon us, and occluding the sense of a larger horizon. So in this sense, the gaze of the spettatore, spectator, is turned in Calvino's narrative into the myopic gaze of the scrutatore, scrutinizer, in the novel La giornata di uno scrutatore, The Day of a Scrutinizer, fantastic novel, by the way. And also the wandering outlook on the sea is turned into a speculazione, speculation, which literally means self-mirroring, as expressed in the novel La speculazione edilizia, speculation on real estate. In Fellini's cinema, what is close finds expression then through what Calvino calls a visual repugnance, as we saw in The Marine Monster, which, once again, I quote Calvino, forces us to admit that what we would like to avoid is close. So through visions and flashes of a lost childhood, as for Guido in Otto e Mezzo, who looks at these fragments like Calvino as incomprehensible yet potential inspirations for his film, and through the demystification of what is not immediately seen, as for example in La Dolce Vita, in the miraculous vision of the Virgin Mary by a few children in the outskirts of Rome, which is transformed into a live show for the Italian TV rights. So the demystification, the grotesque demystification of the instant that we saw earlier as well. Now, this sense of asphyxiating closeness And the inability to find an open sea, or the pursuit of this open sea and larger horizon where imagination can freely fly, is really the visual premise of Fellini's Otto e Mezzo, as we see in this clip. And this is the opening of Otto e Mezzo by Fellini, where we'll see the character, the director, trying to escape from this asphyxiating closeness in a set of cars that we'll see, and fly to look for the sea. They're all close. They're all looking at each other and staring at each other's life. The closeness as asphyxiation. The upper window and the escape. The flight of imagination over the sea. And someone pulls him back.
Avvocato, l'ho preso. Ehi! Giù! Vieni giù! Giù definitivamente.
Down in the fall. And this is a dream at the beginning of 8.5. Now the director tries to escape Guido, interpreted by Marcello Mastroianni, and once again the setting is the sea, but he's called back to Earth, where he will look for a subject of his movie. Now the cinematographic image then is no longer focused on the imaginative observation of reality, but rather on self-observation, the gesture of looking at oneself looking, and self-reflection, and the inevitable deformation that is produced by self-reflection. If you place yourself in front of, in between two mirrors, the self-reflection becomes an infinite deformation. This is what happens in Fellini's cinema, also in Calvino. The disenchantment for distance, hence, is expressed through the technique by which Calvino states the camera turns its back to the set. As Calvino puts it, the movie of which we illuded ourselves to be only spectators is the story of our life. And it is at this point that the autobiographies of Fellino and Calvino arrive at the same coincidence of the I, the self, with the I, so the gaze, the vision, as we'll see expressed in two techniques, the techniques of present writing, so the closeness to the instant, and meta writing, where the object of narration is storytelling itself. Now, the gaze on the instant at the present indicative will become a key feature of Calvino's experimental writing in the second half of his career. A gaze photographing the real as it happens in its progress in order not to lose it. This precedes of a few decades our use of the iPhone, where we constantly photograph every instant as it happens. This is a gaze symbolized by his hero, Palomar, named after the Californian Astronomical Observatory, which tries to see the universe in ruins and order fragments into a story in the making. This is the same gaze of the journalist Marcello Rubini, protagonist of La Dolce Vita, only focused on what is current news, preceding of a few decades like TV networks or social media, like only the present without no longer being capable of detecting the depth or meaning in things. As we see, for example, in the scene where in La Dolce Vita, where the intellectual Steiner, his friend, plays for his guests the recorded sounds of nature, so a storm, the wind, and where the guests can even recognize them. So they listen to what occurs in the present, but without their meaning, without its depth. This present gaze upon the void of an inevitable loss of the incommunicability that we saw in the end of La Dolce Vita will become really a driving force to not fall into death or meaninglessness, as Calvino would later summarize it in his memo for the new millennium, in the image of storytelling as the light, self-sustaining leap of Cavalcanti over the tombs of Epicureans. So the more we tell, the more we continue talking about stuff that is happening in the present, the more we stay in the air, we stay afloat without falling into emptiness and meaninglessness. At the same time, the narration of closeness takes shape around the doubling of the self, seen as both the subject and the object of storytelling. So the self-mirroring vision of a narrating self is the object of Fellini's Otto e Mezzo, telling the story of a director in search of a story. And at the same time, this is also the same plot of Calvino's later novel, Se una notte d'inverno un viaggiatore, a framed fiction following a reader reading If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler by Italo Calvino, so metafiction. In this sense, the imaginative spectating of their youth once again becomes speculating, from the Latin speculum, for mirror. That is, autoreflexivity. And at the same time, this becomes really the surveying of details and the surveying of one's own conscious gesture of looking. Now, in light of these observations, it is fair to say that the critical account on Fellini's cinema in the second part of Calvino's autobiography of a spectator is not a separate piece, but rather the natural conclusion of his short story. And in dialogue with Fellini, Calvino is pursuing through narrative the awareness of this lost piece or lost good. On the one hand, what remains, so names, fragments, objects, becomes the platform of a new search, as we see in the short story itself, which is a quest for the origin of his vocation as a storyteller in a live dialogue with readers. And as we also see in the conclusion of his later novel, If on a Winter's Night, a Traveler, when Calvino states, and I quote, "There was someone who walked by a solitary road and saw something that struck his attention, something that seemed to hide a mystery or a premonition. And as he asked for explanation, someone started telling him a long story." So even these details that have lost their meaning, they can contain the force to tell a story anyways. Now, if absence is the origin of the narrative movement, this loss, then fiction develops as a continuous combination of stories, weaving. Text means weaving of stories, where, as seen in The Castle of Crossed Destinies, and I quote, "Every tale crosses another tale in a system of infinite relations of everything with everything." So the image of the web in literature, in cinema, but also in our world, becomes a way or a form of reconstruction of the original wandering of fantasy and the infinite combination of variables. Now, in retrieving the early intuition of the mechanisms of a story in the American cinema of the 1930s, Calvino then re-elaborates in an existential form the intuition at the base of his philological work with Italian fairy tales and of his own experimental narrative as continuous metamorphosis. Now, in a passage of his American lesson on visibility, he will describe this experience in reference to comic magazines of the period, so Zavattini. And he says, I spent hours watching cartoons of every series from an issue to another. I mentally told myself the stories, interpreting the scenes in different ways. I produced variants. I combined single episodes in a larger story. I discovered and isolated and connected constants in every series. I fused one series into another. I imagined new series where secondary characters became protagonists. So the mechanism of writing in the interweaving of stories. Now, the investigation on the origin and movement of stories leads then the author to reflect on their destination, as seen, for example, in the stage dialectics between order and chaos, underlying the opposition between cinema and reality. On the one hand, Calvino observes reality or his own self as a heap of what he calls heterogeneous elements which seem to be assembled by chance, the materials of his life which look deprived of any form. On the other hand, as suggested by the opening of a dome in the theater during the summer, when he was a kid watching the movies at Sanremo, Calvino identifies an order in stories themselves, which, like the dome, offered what he calls a sky, which incorporated all the distances in one universe. The same dialectics which will close his invisible cities between what is hell and what hell is not, is then revisited in reference to his own adolescence, in the opposition between the meaninglessness of the world and the possibility of an elsewhere behind the screen. So the screen, or narrative itself, is ultimately a window open to the possibility of what Calvino calls elsewhere, somewhere else, otherwise, altrove, altra volta, altrimenti, where a lost or flat reality could be projected beyond, in the future, in the elsewhere, in the difficult, più in là, nel futuro, o nell'altrove, o nel difficile. The screen, then, is the specular reverse of reality. It's contrary, as it possesses the properties of a world, fullness, necessity, and coherence. In a later story, The Adventure of a Myopic, Calvino expresses this urge of storytelling to go beyond the page or our flat world in the protagonist's vision of the starry sky. And here is what he says. The character lifted his eyes toward the starry sky and discovered that the stars were not jammed on the bottom of the firmament as broken eggs, but rather they were thin piercings which open around infinite distances. So also in Fellini, and with this I conclude, the screen has this function to show another dimension beyond the flatness of closeness and regain not just the wanderings of his youth, but rather the possibility of meaning itself. And this is what you'll see in this fascinating ad that Fellini directed for Campari in 1984, where once again, the window of a train becomes a mirror or a screen of dreams. And here is the ad, and we'll see how Fellini transposes like his cinematographic aesthetics also in the creation of commercials, advertisings. And here's Campari's ad with the window that becomes a screen that brings us beyond.
Cantare.
Okay, and with this, I really, Grude, I really want to thank you for being here with me today. And I hope this will be an invitation to watch again Fellini's movies, to read again Calvino's books, with this image of like two wanderers who gave expression to kind of a modern trajectory, the disenchantment of modernity, but also found within this context also a way out, or a way to express something more than just the closeness or the meaninglessness of things. But really, storytelling becomes for both of them a way to regain this window open to reality and to a broader horizon or awareness of ourselves in the world. Thank you.